Halo Survival, a fan-made audio drama produced by Podcast Evolved. The Office of Naval Intelligence had long ago become aware of the tactical value of the Halo installations following the events of the Battle of Installation 04, while subsequent co-collaboration relationships with the Swords of Sanghelios were strenuous at best. Oni had still ensured they had plenty of resources positioned near enough to the rings to deploy assets rapidly if the need ever arrived. In the wake of the created uprising, Oni had placed enough facilities on high alert around the galaxy, ensuring the UNSC assets were ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. Oni Midpoint Station was one such valuable facility, a ship retrofitting station positioned close enough to Zeta Halo to provide assistance to UNSC science and security teams on the ring in the event of an incident. The usually quiet facility was alive with activity today. Flatbed warthogs maneuvered through the busy hallways, and the UNSC crew busied themselves with activities. In the main hangar, an Oni Prowler, the UNSC Swift Gist, was being worked on by a team of UNSC technicians who moved busily around the vehicle, hammering things into place and wielding on new pieces of equipment. Deeper in the station, Captain Chris Cooper walked down a corridor, Sergeant Maria Holt keeping the brisk pace at his side.
I don't like it. The Created are causing chaos around the galaxy, and we're here at a backwater UNSC station near a Halo ring which hasn't seen any activity for weeks. We should be on the front lines.
I agree, but there isn't much we can do about it right now. Oni are stretched thin as it is. They have special forces playing special delivery wherever's possible right now. Hell, word around the station is they haven't heard from Osmond or Black Box in weeks.
Damn.
Cooper sighed, opening a briefing folder which was in his hands. He began to read through the documents.
Any idea why these signal jamming devices are so vital to the work they're doing on Zeta?
Negative, but I bet we're about to find out.
The pair walked past a couple of Marines who nodded to them, and then entered a large briefing room. The rest of Rhino Squad, the Oni unit which Cooper commanded, were already sitting in the chairs, waiting for them.
Hey, Cap. Good to see you at last.
Yeah, we were worried you'd get lost.
Cooper shook his head. Alongside the two male Marines, Private Natalie Vorstock also sat in another one of the theater-style chairs in the briefing room, spinning around from a sniper rifle around her fingers and staring at it intently. The captain turned from the Marines to greet a tall man in a white lab coat.
Dr. Talbot, I'm Captain Chris Cooper, and this is Sergeant Maria Holt. Rhino Squadron were ordered to report here for a briefing on a special operations, I believe?
Yes, that's right, Captain. I have some important work which I need an escort for. You'll learn more in a moment. Please, take a seat.
The doctor motioned to the seats.
What's with the secrecy?
It's all very necessary, I assure you. Security protocol, Theta 16.
There was a beep, and the sliding door to the room hissed shut and locked with a click, whilst the lights within the briefing room began to dim. At the same time, there was a static crackle as the Marines noticed that their comms devices were disconnected. Cooper shot Talbot an alarmed look.
We can't be too careful. Smart AI end up everywhere.
A projector whirred into life, and a diagram of a metallic item titled as Signal Dampening Model 14 appeared on the screen in front of the Marines. The large metallic object was a freestanding item, which appeared to have a control console on it, and it was also mounted with various solar power energy generators. It was heavy-grade tech, that much was for sure.
As you are all fully aware now, Cortana's Guardians have attacked UNSC facilities across the galaxy and are continuing to stamp out any indication of resistance. All remaining UNSC facilities are being ordered to minimal operations where possible, and any moving command bases, like the Infinity, are off the grid. We know that superluminal communications spike her interest, so communicating effectively is near impossible right now. In short, we're on our own, and Midpoint Station will not stay that way for long. We know Cortana's Guardians have been frequenting the Halo rings all throughout the galaxy.
Doesn't surprise me. Cyber Lady is a psychopath.
Stow it.
Thank you for that, Marine. As I was saying, we know that Cortana's Guardians have been frequenting the Halo installations. Oni currently has a high-level operation on Zeta Halo, researching the depths of the Forerunner complexes, including studies on the artificial intelligence constructs, which we refer to as Sentinels. Right now, our scientists are deep in their research. And if Cortana senses what they are up to, then we may lose a vital shot at understanding the assets which she has under her control. We can't risk one of their experiments accidentally triggering a signal which will bring them to her attention. So we need to take action to protect their work. This is where the signal dampening module you'll see detailed on the screen comes in.
Talbot pressed a button on a clicker in his hand, and the screen changed to an image of several UNSC crates stowed in a cargo bay.
These were loaded about the UNSC Swift Gist when she came aboard this station. She is currently being retrofitted with similar technology to the dampeners to allow us to use her without being detected.
I don't like where this is going.
O'Neill mumbled.
If we can set up a network of signal dampening modules on Zeta Halo, then we can hide the work which Oni are doing on the ring, and can prevent Cortana from picking our comms up from orbit. This will mean that we can continue our work on the ring, and can potentially find a way to fight back more effectively. Rhino Squad are tasked with escorting both the precious cargo and I to Zeta Halo, where we will establish this network on the ground. We will then rendezvous with the facility commanders on the ground, check the network is functioning, and get out before Cortana is any the wiser.
Seems like an important op, Doc. Why Rhino?
The doctor let out a long sigh.
There is scarcely anyone else left, or if they are left, we don't have a chance in hell at contacting them. This can't wait till Osmond or someone else is back online. We have to do this op, and we have to do it now. Intel suggests the Guardian found in the system has been dispatched to another location. What's left of command estimates that we have 12 hours to get boots on the ground and get out before it returns. This operation is of imminent importance. Section Commander Fredericks has already approved it. Any questions?
Yeah, I've got one, Doc. How do we know this will work?
We don't, but we don't have time to test it. This is the best science we have available right now based on how we believe the Guardians work. We have to try. If we don't, months of research may be lost.
All I need to know, Doc, when it comes to escort missions like this, I would rather work with you than somebody like Dr. Halsey.
Agreed. Marines, head to the armory and pack your bags. Travel light, but make sure you're equipped for field deployment. Rendezvous on the hangar deck in 30 minutes and we'll get ready to depart.
Yes, sir!
The lights brightened, and the door slid open as the Marines walked out. Talbot powered off the screen and began to pack the rucksack he had propped up in the corner of the room, scooping up items from a podium in front of the screen. 30 minutes later, Rhino Squad were beginning to load up onto the UNSC Swift Gist. The Prowler was a larger variant, and so some of the deck crew were loading a pair of Warthogs with chain gun turrets into the back of the vehicle's cargo deck, so the team had transportation once they arrived on the ring. Other supplies, like MREs and medical supplies, were also being loaded onto the vehicle. Dr. Talbot and Captain Chris Cooper were the last pair to enter the hangar, talking under their breaths as they approached the vehicle.
You know Cortana isn't the only one out here, right?
Oni are aware of other factions at play, yes.
So you know this has the potential to go ass up really quickly.
Captain, this isn't my first rodeo.
He turned and walked towards the Prowler. The captain broke into a light jog and followed him up the ramp. A few moments later, the deckhands cleared the hangar and stowed their equipment. There was a gentle buzz as the engines of the Prowler began to glow a bright, vivid blue. Suddenly, there was a sharp roar as the vehicle tore into the air and shot out of the hangar into the black void beyond. In a dark void segmented by various bright lights of stars and other celestial bodies, Installation 07, also known as Zeta Halo, hung deathly still in space. There were no space vessels around the ring, no sign of UNSC activity. Indeed, from space, it appeared as if the Halo ring was entirely dormant. The Oni forces on the ring seemingly hidden in plain sight from any potential hostile entities. As the Oni Prowler UNSC Swift Gist emerged from a slipspace portal and began to gain ground on the installation, Captain Cooper walked onto the bridge of the vessel, where two UNSC technicians were working hard behind their consoles to guide the Prowler closer to the ring.
Okay, open encrypted channel 7. Broadcast to all UNSC designated assets on the ring. Let's find out where we're needed.
One of the technicians turned to look at the captain.
Blackout protocol's in effect, sir. We won't be able to raise any UNSC forces from the orbit, and attempting to do so may bring us more attention.
Do we have an approximate location of the facility so we can sweep in and deliver our cargo?
The second technician flicked a few buttons and brought up a holographic, topographical view of the surface of Zeta Halo. The topography of the ring was fascinating, with every kind of microclimate decorating the surface of the planet. Eventually, the technician zoomed into a valley thick with trees and shrubbery. In the middle of the valley, in a clearing, a large UNSC facility was visible.
The compound is tucked away in the valley. We won't be able to land there. But we have found a safer landing spot hidden in the mountainside.
The holographic view changed to show a rocky plateau in the mountains. It connected onto some dirt tracks, which would eventually lead the Marines to an outpost if they took the warthogs, which were stowed in the bay. Cooper stroked his chin and nodded.
Okay, bring us down at the plateau and lock down the ship once we've left. We'll deliver the cargo using the warhogs. While we're setting up, I'll send the Marines with the warhogs back here to secure the LZ.
Affirmative. You might want to buckle in, sir.
In the cargo hold of the Prowler, the rest of the Marines were rapidly preparing the warthogs for deployment once they hit the ground. O'Neill and Wisner were working on one of the M46 Vulcan turrets, connecting up the ammunition belt of the turret to the canister which was mounted lower on the turret's frame. Vorstock was behind them, mounting red jerry cans on the back of the Warthog in case they found themselves in the field extensively and needed to top up on the Warthog's hydrogen levels. Across the hold, Holt was filling a few BR-55 magazines with 9.5 by 40mm rounds from a metal ammunition container which was mounted on a folding table in the hold. After she completed filling each of the magazines, she slotted them into pouches on her combat webbing, securing them in place ready for their deployment in the field.
Hey Sarge, are we expecting trouble? Or are all these weapons just so we can look pretty?
Holt placed the magazine she was filling on the table and turned around to face the rest of the Marines as they were talking.
You've all heard the stories about the Halo rings. Unpredictability kind of comes with the territory.
But the Master Chief was never deployed on Zeta Halo, right? This ring never got dragged into the war?
You're right, O'Neill. Installation 07 never got dragged into the war. But that doesn't mean that it isn't subject of interest for other factions at play in the galaxy right now. You can never be too careful.
Holt turned, walking over to Vorstock, who was still silent.
Nat, are you okay? I know you're usually the strong silent type, but you haven't said a word since we got this mission.
Natalie nodded and looked up at the sergeant.
I'm fine. Just didn't think I'd be setting foot on a Halo again. Let's get this done.
At that very moment, there was an announcement sound over the intercom of the Prowler.
T-minus 5 minutes till touchdown. Finish what you're doing and strap yourselves in. As soon as we land, we're taking the warhogs out to Alpha Site. I'll be joining you shortly.
From a small office overlooking the troop bay, Nate Talbot looked nervously at the warthogs and the weapons which the Marines were handling. He was confident he'd delivered the mission briefing perfectly, but he wasn't so sure that this false shield of courage he had put up throughout the operation would withstand the coming journey. He wasn't sure how the Marines would feel if they learned that their field scientist had never actually been deployed in the field. Still, he would rather face their fury than the fury of an AI. In some ways, he was surprised Oni hadn't seen the uprising coming. The more they researched into Forerunners, the more they had uncovered about their relationship with AI, and how they eventually destroyed each other when pitted against one another. It was disturbing to see humanity falling down the same path, but there was nothing anyone could do now. He let out a deep sigh and then sat in a chair behind a white, clinical-looking desk, securing himself with a waist harness as the Prowler began its descent onto the ring. A few moments later, the Oni Prowler was gliding past snow-caked mountains and peaks as it approached the flat landing area which they had identified from orbit. The engines began to wind down, and then, with a dull thud, the vehicle touched down and began to settle atop the jagged rockwork. There was the mechanical hiss of pistons working, and then, slowly, the front ramp lowered itself onto the rocks below. Almost as soon as the ramp hit the floor, the two warthogs sped up from the hold and onto the rocks below, bouncing and throwing themselves from side to side as they headed down the side of the valley and began to wind down the mountains which shielded the landing zone from sight. Talbot sat fiddling with the signal dampener secured to the side of the second vehicle.
Doctor, is that thing going to be ready to go as soon as we arrive?
I believe so. If it needs any work, then the science team at the facility should have all the resources I need. Anyway, We'll be online in no time.
The convoy of 2 vehicles made its way through the thick forest. In the distance, the moans and groans of large animals could be heard, although the Marines weren't convinced they would know what these animals were. The vehicles drove for some time before eventually breaking into a clearing where they saw the UNSC facility in front of them. As they approached the facility, Cooper activated his comms and spoke to the Marines.
No sentries on guard? I'm having a word with the base commander. I know we're tight on resources, but this is a serious breach of security.
The Warthogs ground to a halt just outside the gate for the compound, and the Marines disembarked, quickly unloading the signal emitter. Weisner and Holt picked it up and began to carry it into the center of the compound.
I'd kill for a forklift right now.
Cooper turned to the rest of the squad before they could walk into the compound.
O'Neill, Vostok, I need you to head back to the Prowler with the Hogs. We could be a while, so it makes sense to have some security at the landing zone.
Oh man, I never get the fun jobs.
Cooper turned to Talbot.
Come on, Doc. Let's get this done.
As the Warthogs began to drive away from the compound, the captain and the doctor walked in through the gates and quickly stopped. They could see Holt and Weisner, weapons drawn, the device on the ground next to them. Then, they began to take in their surroundings, and for the first time they realized that not all was as it seemed at the UNSC compound. The prefabricated buildings were strewn with debris, bullet holes and burn marks adorning their exterior shells and providing glimpses at the interiors. Flames licked hungrily at the rich air and caused small streamers of smoke to waft out of the little holes in the buildings. Storage crates were overturned, and here and there an assault rifle or battle rifle lay, rounds strewn around it, magazines empty. Cooper couldn't help but gasp as he looked around the compound.
Orders, Captain.
Holt said firmly. Cooper immediately activated his intercom.
O'Neill, Vostok, delay my order. Find somewhere to park up in the woods and keep your heads on a swivel. We're not alone out here.
He then turned to the sergeant.
You and Weisner need to secure the compound. I'll stay with the doctor while he sets up the device. We still have a mission to complete.
Holt nodded and motioned with a single finger forwards. Her and Weisner crept forward whilst the doctor moved into the clearing in the middle of the base and began to set up the device which was in his hands. He threaded cables and began to connect different aspects whilst Cooper crouched next to him with his DMR raised.
Work fast, Doc. We don't know what's out there.
Weisner and Holt continued to tiptoe through the compound with their weapons raised. Occasionally, they would find blood splatter and gore, which hinted that something even worse had occurred here. But there was nothing to indicate fatalities. It was strange. Judging by the amount of damage which the compound had endured, you would expect there to be casualties. But there was no sign of any UNSC forces which had inhabited the compound. They attempted to access the barracks building, but were met with a fire they couldn't get through, and had begun to creep towards the far side of the compound, where a field laboratory was established, when Holt motioned for them to pause.
Did you hear that?
They crept around the corner, and there they saw what they had dreaded. It was a sight Holt hadn't seen since the Human Covenant War, and she felt a knot in her stomach, and anger bubbling away from the surface as she remembered all the friends she had lost to them. A pair of Jorahane, known to the humans as brutes, were stood overseeing a group of Ongoi, who were known as grunts. They carried weaponry and were admonished in a variety of different colors, with one consistent feature. All of the aliens featured armor which displayed the bright red logo of the Banished, a dangerous and deadly mercenary faction which formed in the wake of the war. Oni had been monitoring their activities for some time, but to see them here, on Zeta Halo, meant trouble.
Sarge, we need to get back to the captain and get out of here. Now.
She nodded, and the two quickly retreated, beginning to move back to the captain and the doctor. They sprinted around the corner and made it back to the two members of their crew. Before they could say anything, there was an ear-splitting bloom as a fuel rod round exploded to the side of their position, sending green plasma searing into a building and causing debris to spit across them. Suddenly, more banished forces emerged from all around them, approaching them from all sides. Plasma rounds and spikes came at them from every angle, and the Free Marines and the Doctor desperately found cover wherever they could, as the advancing alien forces continued to pepper them with rounds. It was clear. They had to get out of here, now, or they would die on this ring.
Weisner, 2 brutes moving in on your 6 o'clock. Suppressing fire.
I don't know if you've noticed, Sarge, but there are brutes everywhere.
There was an explosion as Weisner discharged 2 rockets from a Spanker rocket launcher which was in his hands, before he placed the weapon on the floor and unslung an MA-40 assault rifle from his back, spraying suppressing fire in the direction he had fired the rocket launcher. The Marines were embedded within the center of the compound, taking cover behind Jersey barriers. In the center of the compound, a man in an UNSC science field uniform was attempting to attend to some kind of large metallic device, which was looking like an emitter of some kind. He was ducking between plasma fire and typing into a control console when a needler round struck him in the shoulder.
Talbot's been hit. O'Neill, Vostok, we need the Warthogs here now.
Captain Chris Cooper, the oldest and most gruff-looking of the Marines, shouted, firing a couple of rounds from a designated marksman's rifle before reaching for a comms device mounted onto his chest plate. The man on the ground sprawled in a pool of red blood, screaming as his field uniform became drenched in a dark crimson.
Help. I can't feel my shoulder.
Hang on. We're going to...
There was a small explosion as a round from a fuel rod cannon struck the emitter, and it collapsed onto Talbot. He let out another yelp of pain, and then fell deathly silent.
Damn it! If we lose Talbot, then she'll be all over us in no time. Holt, Weisner, cover me. Where the hell are those Warthogs?
Cooper shouted, sprinting out from his cover. He hauled the collapsed emitter off of Talbot and slung the DMR over his shoulder, dragging Talbot out and into cover. There was an alien hum as a couple of ghosts began to appear at the far end of the compound and peppered the position the Marines were holding with plasma fire. Hot plasma tore through concrete and metal, shredding through their cover and quickly destroying what little protection they had. The Marines realized their position was no longer attainable. They needed to move.
Holt, Weisner, we're leaving. Provide cover fire. We'll exfil via the south side of the compound.
Cooper said, hauling Talbot's limp body up and over his shoulder as rounds continued to fly.
Raj, Weisner, on me!
Slowly, the group of 4 humans pulled back through the compound. They retreated past the burning buildings, overturned storage containers, and bits and pieces of scattered and broken UNSC equipment as they approached the perimeter fence of the small compound. The fence had seen better days, with long stretches collapsed and other pieces burned through with plasma. As they continued their retreat, they tried their best to return fire at the alien forces, who were closing in on every side, with plasma rounds and explosions tearing at the ground at their feet and piercing through the buildings on either side of them. Whilst Cooper ducked through the fence and hauled Talbot's body through it, Weisner and Holt crouched down in front of him, alternating between targets as they continued to engage the enemy.
Sarge, Jackal Sniper, 11 o'clock.
Weisner shouted, crouching as Holt twisted around and fired a BR-55 over the Marine's back.
Good spot. Run, 4 o'clock.
He's toast!
Weisner replied, almost gleeful, as a burst of fire from his MA-40 put the enemy down. The Marines then followed Cooper through the fence. The captain hauled Talbot off his shoulder and set him down, propping him up against the fence as he pulled the DMR off his back and reloaded it. The other Marines began to do the same, taking stock of the ammunition they had left after the intense firefight.
Only got a few rounds left. How are you looking?
Cooper shouted over the cacophony of sound.
2 AR mags left, sir. Spanker's gone. Dropped it in the compound.
1 frag grenade and 1 mag. I've also got 2 mags for my sidearm.
Damn it.
Cooper replied, the grim situation becoming clear.
Where the hell are those?
Cooper was cut off as a pair of M12 Warthog LRVs tore up the grass next to the compound and skidded to a halt in front of the small human team. The vehicles were the workhorses of the UNSC ground fleet, and they were used for everything from reconnaissance to case evac, which is what they were being used for in this case. Their exposed driver and passenger compartments meant that the squad could see their companions inside the hogs as they pulled to a stop. The Marine in the front convoy vehicle, Private Dan O'Neill, cocked a smile at Wisner.
Jeez, Wisner. You ain't a looker, but even you look like shit.
I may not be a looker, but at least I know how to get somewhere on time.
Stow it, Marines.
Holt stated, hoping Cooper to lift Talbot up into the passenger seat of the first Warthog. Wisner climbed onto the light chain gun mounted on the back of the front vehicle's chassis. Holt and Cooper then sprinted back to the second Warthog, where a silent Private Natalie Vorstock sat behind the wheel. She nodded to the captain and the sergeant. The captain hopped into the passenger seat whilst Holt climbed onto the chain gun turret and cocked the weapon.
Let's move out, Marines! Get us back to the ship!
The Warthogs quickly gunned it away from the compound, and in no time at all, both Holt and Wisner were opening up the chain guns mounted on the back of the vehicles to pick off their ghost pursuers as they proceeded to head deeper into the woodlands surrounding the compound. Eventually, they lost their tail and continued to head deeper across the landscape, climbing higher into the mountains where the landing zone they had established was hidden. As they climbed the mountainside, the sprawling landscape around them became more and more pronounced. Interesting structures appeared to float in the sky, and bits and pieces of the landscape almost felt modular, feeling assembled by scratch, but not quite finished, as jagged edges and square corners twisted upwards. The most interesting thing, however, was the long horizon which climbed upwards and slowly began to curve into the sky, reminding the Marines that they were, in fact, on a halo ring. The convoy of two Warthogs tore up the rocky road and rapidly approached the plateau on which the UNSC Swiftgist was waiting. The smooth chassis work of the vehicles were now dented and burnt, scorch marks and small impact craters tearing deep into their pristine architecture. The footwell of the first Warthog was a mess, with blood pooled and splattered, contrasting against its stark interior features. Talbot groaned in pain.
I didn't get a chance to.
His voice broke off with a gurgle as he coughed up some dark red blood. O'Neill's usual cocksure attitude was replaced with one of genuine concern.
Hang on, Doc. We're almost at the ship.
Just coming up on her now!
Wisner called from the back, motioning with his hand to the vehicle behind theirs, so that Vorstock, Cooper, and Holt would also know that they were arriving at the vehicle. In the rear vehicle, the captain pressed an intercom on his chest plate and twisted a knob so that he was on the same frequency as the technicians inside the Prowler.
Banished forces are on the ring. Prepare for immediate departure. I'll come up to the bridge to let you know when we're ready to go.
Affirmative, sir.
An urgent reply came back. On the ridgeline, the Prowler vessel came into view, sitting where the team had first arrived on Zeta Halo only a short while earlier. There was a hiss as they neared the vehicle, and the ramp for the cargo bay was rapidly lowered so the vehicles could gun it into the bay. Both of the vehicles barreled into the hold and skidded to a halt, with the Marines frantically dismounting their vehicles and heading to the first one in order to support Talbot.
I'll oversee getting him to the medical bay. Get to the bridge.
Holt said to Cooper with a nod as the two parted ways and the captain sprinted over to the elevator. Holt moved forward to the vehicle. It wasn't good. Blood was gushing from Talbot's open wound, and he was left screaming in pain. O'Neill and Wisner pulled him from the vehicle, but now he was propped up against the side of the Warthog. His breathing was ragged, and his skin had become pale and clammy. Holt knew it wasn't good. Vorstock followed Holt, as her and the other Marines began to surround the doctor.
Marines, we need to get him to the medical bay.
She turned to Vorstock.
Head to the medical bay and get it ready.
The Marine nodded and turned, jogging down a small hallway behind them. Holt then turned to the Marines. Talbot looked at her, fear vivid in his eyes for the first time. Then, abruptly, his eyes shut as he slumped against the side of the vehicle.
Crap.
Wisner exclaimed, kneeling down and shaking the man.
Doc. Wake up. Can you hear me?
O'Neill knelt down to join him. He lifted the man's limp wrist gingerly and checked for a pulse.
I've got a pulse, but it's faint.
He said, turning to Holt.
We need to move him now, ma'am.
All right, let's do it, Marines.
She said, and the Free Marines began to take up positions around the man, working out the best way to carry him down the corridor and into the awaiting medical bay. Whilst the Marines took Talbot slowly to the medical bay, Cooper burst onto the bridge, slamming his hands on the control chairs as two technicians inside busily prepared the vehicle for departure. He reached between their chairs and activated a panel on the vehicle's communications dashboard. One of the technicians turned to him.
Captain, we can't contact the station now. The transmission will trigger the communications beacon and will alert the Guardian.
Get us ready for liftoff. We'll get out of here before the Guardian arrives. This can't wait.
He squeezed the comms button in and pulled a headset away from the dashboard.
Midpoint Station, this is Rhino 01. We have been compromised. Banished forces are present on Zeta Halo. Request new rendezvous coordinates immediately.
The line crackled, and there was no response.
Midpoint Station, please respond.
The line crackled again. Cooper slammed his fist down on the console and threw the headset back into place.
Something's gone wrong. Get us off this ring now.
In the medbay, Talbot was sprawled out onto the operating table. Screaming, Vorstock and Holt were attempting to treat his injuries, whilst Winsner and O'Neill stood in the hallway, watching the horror. The usual banter the Marine Squad shared had gone, with the space replaced with eerie silence. Everyone knew it didn't look good.
Hand me the scanner.
Holt said to Vorstock. The female Marine turned and reached into the medical drawer, pulling out a handheld scanning device which could be used to find where the doctor's injury was. Holt went across the doctor's chest and stomach, where the bulk of the impact he had suffered had been, and found something.
Shit. He's got a collapsed lung. Nat, is there any biofilm in there?
Vorstock looked through some of the drawers, eventually finding a small container with a handheld pump and nozzle at one end. She looked across it, and then passed it over to Holt.
We don't have the equipment to treat this here.
She said.
I know.
Holt sighed, injecting the nozzle into the cavity present in the man's chest. On the bridge, the captain was beginning to take in the empty void of space, as it once again began to expand through the viewport in front of them. Stars and space systems of various descriptions could be seen in the distance, and it seemed that, for the most part, things had gone off relatively easily. He looked across the empty space and allowed himself a gentle smile. They had made it off the ring, and they were going to be able to get back to command, get some reinforcements, and come back and find out what happened to their forces. Satisfied with this thought, he went to turn out of the bridge, when one of the technicians exclaimed out loud,
What the hell is that?
Cooper turned and felt his blood run cold. Emerging from a portal of blue energy, the shape of a silver bird-like construct began to emerge from the portal, with thick, angular wings emerging and what could only be described as a metallic head with a pair of menacing blue eyes. The structure of the vessel was like nothing he had ever seen before. Separate segments of metal and raw light connected by seemingly nothing, but assembling one of the most beautiful sights he had ever seen. As the artificial being finished unfolding itself, it took a moment to settle, and then it appeared as though its lights, which adorned its body, began to grow brighter, the intensity of its eyes becoming blinding, penetrating every corner of the cockpit. Cooper and the two technicians had to cover their eyes as the lights continued to expand, and then the noise began. It was a horrific, high-pitched moan that almost began to sound like singing, but it had a thick, ominous tone underneath it, which grew in intensity the longer it went on. Suddenly, it let out what sounded like a roar. And a pulse of blue energy tore through the prowler, sucking the life from its engines. Computer consoles blinked off in a second, and the vessel was suddenly plunged into red emergency lighting as it lurched with the impact. The medical bay was thrown into darkness as the emergency lights kicked in. Weisner and O'Neill were thrown onto the floor as the vehicle lurched again and began to get sucked in by the gravity of the planet. Around the table, Holt and Vorstock were gripping onto the sides of it for dear life, looking at it with confused expressions on their faces as they felt the spaceship begin to drop from underneath them and plummet back towards the surface from which they just came. Things were thrown into the air by the turbulent re-entry. A cabinet in the corner fell, and Vorstock had to dive in the way to prevent it from falling onto Talbot's bed, as the man stared wide-eyed at the ceiling, whilst everyone else seemed confused and shocked at what they were experiencing. His wide-eyed grimace told them what they had already put together, as explosions began to sound in the distance, and the Prowler began to tear itself up as it entered a forced re-entry. He spoke, a soft tone which was a mixture of fear and excitement. Clearly delirious from the blood loss, Holt looked at him, a stunned expression crossing her face, asking him to repeat the sentence which he had just mumbled under his breath. He locked eyes with her, and a gentle smile spread across his face as he said it again.
I always wondered what it would be like to see a Guardian up close.
Holt let out a strained cough as she laid against the cold metal floor. Her head was throbbing, and she felt a sharp pain in one of her legs. She reached up against her head and ran a finger gingerly across her forehead. It was wet. She pulled the finger down in front of her eyes and saw the telltale sign of blood on her fingers. Mustering her might, she pulled herself onto her side and looked across the medical bay. It was in a state. Sparks flickered intermediately from cables which now hung through jagged cracks in the roof, and medical supplies were strewn everywhere. She crawled over the medical cupboard and used it to pull herself onto her feet. Looking at the medical table where Talbot had been lying, he was still there, but he lay very still, his pale white skin interwoven with bloodied clumps where debris had hit him as it fell to the floor. She knew he was gone, but she had no idea about the others.
Nat, are you alright?
She said, struggling to get words out as pain ricocheted through a million points in her body. She could hear flames deeper in the ship, and every now and then there was a horrific, ear-piercing shriek as something within the ship shifted deeper. It was clear they had come down hard, and wherever they were, the Prowler wasn't going to be much good now. Holt heard some movement to her side and instinctively reached to a holster on her thigh, raising the M6H gunfighter Magnum and thumbing the safety.
Chill, boss. It's me.
Are you alright?
I think so. My arm is killing me. Might be dislocated.
She turned to look towards Talbot.
I don't think he's...
It's best not to dwell on it. Let's find the rest of the squad and see if we can get out of here. Weisner and O'Neill are probably down in the hold. Let's go take a look and see if we can find them, and then we can head up to the bridge and get the captain.
The red emergency lighting dimmed the inside of the vessel, but slowly, the two Marines were able to make their way to the doorway which led into the hold. As they entered the doorway, Holt decided it would be best to disclose their presence in case the Marines inside were as twitchy as she was after the crash.
O'Neill, Weisner, you in here, Marines?
Yes, Sarge. Down here.
Holt and Vorstock made it deeper into the hold, and it was clear that the crash hadn't been kind to the vessel. Deep, jagged cuts were torn through the hole on the side, letting bright sunlight burn through the ship. The two war dogs which were parked neatly in the hold moments ago were now mangled and broken. Supplies were strewn across the deck, and a couple of small fires were burning in the far corner of the hold. The far corner of the hold had fallen away completely, revealing a few rocks and a grassy patch of ground which was now charred and burnt. More supplies were strewn across the ground below, too. Holt turned and caught O'Neill and Wisner, who stood next to a metal container. They loaded up magazines with ammunition and then locked them into place on their chest rigs. They smiled as the two Marines walked over to them.
It's good to see you both. How are you both doing?
We've been better, but we'll be alright. Didn't get too beaten up in the crash. A couple of bruises and scrapes, but nothing major. How are you holding up, Sarge?
I'm a little worse for wear, but I'll manage.
There's biofoam and medical supplies in the crate over there if you need it. How is everyone else doing?
Thanks.
Holt looked down at the floor and then back up at the Marines, slight tears forming in her eyes.
Talbot is dead. Must have succumbed to his injuries when we crashed.
I don't know what to say. He was a good man.
Yeah. It won't be the same without him around. Should we get ready to bury him? Does anyone know who?
Right now, we don't have time to say proper goodbyes. That will have to wait. I need to go up and check on the others. Get yourselves loaded up and get prepared to leave in 5.
Holt nodded to Vorstock, who joined her fellow Marines in loading their weapons. And then Holt turned and navigated the corridor to the bridge. Debris was strewn in the corridor, and it had collapsed to one side, giving it an unbalanced appearance, which made it harder to navigate. Smoke billowed thickly from the unseen fires, and a mixture of intense smells mingled in the atmosphere. Holt pushed through and came to the door for the bridge, which was jammed slightly open. She pushed her way through the door and gasped at the sight which greeted her. It was clear the bridge had been hit heavily during the crash. It looked like the Prowler had upturned some of the trees in the woodland as it had crashed, and one of the trees had toppled and smashed through the canopy at the front, causing a lot of the whole of the vehicle to buckle and crumple under the impact. The consoles where the two technicians had sat looked as though they had imploded, with how twisted and gnarled they were, and the bodies of the two crew members who had sat there were now warped and distorted as they were pressed in and amongst the churned-up debris. As Holt took everything in, her eyes fell on Cooper, who was sat against the back wall. His BDUs were bloodied as a large piece of metal had gone straight through his abdomen. As she stared at him, his head moved slightly, and he locked eye contact with her.
Holt!
She quickly moved down next to him, resting her hands on his shoulders as she took in the situation. She knew it wasn't good, and she wanted to comfort him, but knew there was not much she could do. Before she could say anything, he spoke again.
It's okay. None of us know how things are gonna end when we sign up. You're in charge now.
He slowly raised an arm to his neck, and using his last morsel of strength, he tore off his dog tags and placed them in her hands. He closed her fingers around his tags and locked eye contact with her.
Look after them. I know you.
His sentence was cut off as his body became limp and his head fell forwards. Holt had to fight back tears as she clutched onto the dog tags. She then stood stiffly, wiped a tear from her cheek, and saluted.
Goodbye, Captain.
As Holt re-entered the hold, Wisner, O'Neill, and Vorstock turned to look at her. No one said anything, but by the somber look on her face, they all knew what had happened. They would also be aware about the fact that the UNSC chain of command now meant she was in charge of what was left of Rhino Squad. Wisner slung an MA-40 assault rifle on his back and reached onto the table, scooping up a DMR which he passed over to the sergeant. Vorstock and O'Neill were finished loading a pair of BR-55s, and Wisner grabbed a CQ-S4A Bulldog and some shotgun shells for the weapon. The Bulldog was a rarely seen drum magazine shotgun, which the UNSC had in their arsenal, and it would be perfect for clearing any close-quarters structures which the Marines may want to take shelter in. Once they were all loaded up, they stood at attention and turned to face Holt. She sighed and looked down at the dog tags around her neck. She held them in her fingers for a moment, and then looked at the Marines.
The mission is over, but we're not. You're an exceptional group of Marines, and I intend to see to it that you stay that way. And that means I'm going to do everything in my power to keep you alive. We're going to march out and look for somewhere with cover where we can set up shelter for the night. Then we're going to attempt to establish whether there are any other Marines left alive on this ring. We'll rally up survivors, take inventory, and work out the best way we can make the banished pay and hold out for UNSC reinforcements. Are you with me, Marines?
Hoorah!
The Prowler had come down in a relatively clear field, which was lucky for the Marines. Slowly, the soldiers began to pick their way across the field, checking their sectors as they proceeded to begin the long march towards some kind of shelter. As they approached the edge of the field, where a thick and dense forest of pine trees rose up towards the sky, they noticed a wide lake with mountains rising up behind it. The water was a rich and inviting emerald green, and its waves gently lapped at the shoreline as they were caught up in the breeze. In the distance, some kind of animals could be heard grazing, and the sky was rich and alive with exotic birds, which the Marines were pretty sure wouldn't be found on other planets. As they proceeded to maneuver past the perimeter of the lake, the Marines paused for a moment to take a drink from their canteens, and noted that a field of stone rings were erected in an interesting pattern in front of them. They paused and stared at them for a moment.
What do you think they're for?
Why not go touch it and find out?
Holt walked up to them and looked at them more intently. There were what appeared to be Forerunner engravings across them, but you couldn't make out much more than that. Abruptly, however, the indistinguishable sound of a phantom approaching made her turn and motion to the Marines to get into the woodland. The Phantom was a popular dropship used by the Covenant during the war, and it was now adopted by rogue factions like the Banished. Wherever there was a dropship like this, ground troops and armor would not be far behind.
Let's get some cover. Won't be long before the Banished arrive at the crash site.
As the Marines continued into the woodland, they made sure to scan their vectors. The woods were thick and vast, but they weren't too dissimilar to the large-scale redwoods which used to be present on Earth. It felt like they had stepped back in time, into a picturesque look at how Earth used to look like before the Human Covenant War. As they continued to walk further into the woodland, every now and then they would spot little creatures scurrying about, seemingly scared of them as they approached. They were small quadrupedal animals with humped backs, and they almost appeared similar to animals which had existed on Earth. O'Neill was the first one to notice.
Hey, Weisner, what are the chances of a halo ring having gophers on it?
They're not gophers, you idiot. They're too big.
Oh, really? Well, what are they then, genius?
The Marines stopped their bickering as Holt held up a fist, motioning for them to hold. They had arrived at a clearing in the woodland, and there were larger animals grazing the area. They appeared almost like rhinos, only with longer, curved horns which rose upwards from their snouts, and also thick and heavier skin adorning their necks. They seemed docile enough to Holt, but she wasn't sure how they would react to the presence of humans on the ring, and wasn't convinced that she wanted to risk it.
We need to go around.
The Marines picked their way past the animals and continued to head deeper into the woods. They encountered the small animals which O'Neill had referred to as gophers occasionally, but beyond that, their journey was relatively quiet. They paused a couple of times to drink water or eat rations, setting up a secure perimeter every time they did, and eventually, they crested a big ridge line which marked the end of the woodland. They clambered up the ridge to the top and were greeted by the sight of a huge Forerunner structure which towered into the sky. The building appeared to have a lower, enclosed section before it had a higher, exposed platform underneath what felt like a larger and smaller right-handed triangle attached to each other. Blue energy span in a circular mechanism in the middle of the structure, and occasionally, the whole structure emitted a blue beam of energy high into the sky. Looking into the skyline, the Marines could see the other emitters were conveying similar signals across the ring as part of some unseen ecosystem. Holt pointed at the structure and smiled.
I Think we found our shelter for the night.
Clear right.
O'Neill shouted as he moved around the corner of the metallic structure with his BR-55 raised. O'Neill used the side-mounted flashlight on his rifle to illuminate the room ahead as he advanced into it. The room was a large, hollow space with a few blue lights decorating it, and what appeared to be some kind of console mounted on one wall, with ancient Forerunner hieroglyphs planned within. The Marines weren't sure what the purpose of the structure was, but its angular tower emitted a blue pulse into the sky every now and then, suggesting it was part of some kind of network. They were sure that Talbot would have loved the finer details, but they were lost on the Marines. They just wanted some shelter. Weisner moved in behind with a CQS-48 shotgun raised. He lowered the weapon and then reached up to his helmet, tapping his comms device to activate it.
Complex secure, Sarge. You and Vorstock can come on in.
O'Neill and Wissner set about placing their weapons down against the wall as they began to assess the space. Weisner reached into one of the pouches on his vest and pulled out some kind of energy bar, peeling back foil as he bit hungrily at it. He finished it and slung the MA-40 he was also carrying off his back and began the process of field stripping it. O'Neill was now sat doing the same with his BR-55. Vorstock walked in with her BR-55 slung across her chest, and the sergeant came in the rear, with her DMR slumped on her back as she drank some water from a canteen.
What's the situation?
Well, it ain't no sundown, but it'll do, Sarge.
It's close quarters. We can't stay here for long. If the Banish were to catch us in here, it'd be like shooting fish in a barrel.
We don't have many good options right now. We just gotta make the best of a bad situation. Hunker down and get some sleep, Marines. It'll be nightfall soon. I'll take the first watch.
Hull went back outside to a ramp which they had passed as they cleared the Forerunner structure, and she climbed it, emerging on a platform which surrounded the apex of the emitter tower. She walked to the edge and sat, her DMR nestled across her legs as she looked out towards the rich and expansive landscape of the ring. Across, in the trees, she could see some animals which weren't too dissimilar to deer found on Earth moving about as a pack, harmlessly calling out to each other as they went. They glowed with a vibrant bioluminescence as they moved, and she found herself mesmerized by these peaceful animals. Birds could still be seen in the night sky, and in the distance, the lights of the Phantom dropships can be seen going to and fro, thick spotlights searching where Sheath assumed the wreckage of the Prowler was now slumped. As she watched, she removed the magazine from her DMR, checked the rounds, and then placed it back in, thumbing the safety. Some time passed, and eventually, Vorstock came up to take on Overwatch. The pair nodded to each other, and Hull headed back down into the structure, where the other Marines were fast asleep. She slumped down in an exhausted heap, and finally let the darkness wash over her as she fell into a restless, haunted sleep.
Sarge! Wake up! Sarge!
Her eyes opened and took a moment to adjust to the light in the room. There was a hissing noise, and it took a moment for her to realize that it was static coming from a radio in O'Neill's hand.
A signal came through on the UNSC emergency band. No words, but it sounds like someone is nearby.
Holt sat up and looked at the Marines in front of her. O'Neill and Eisner were staring at her, eager-eyed and waiting to see what she wanted to do next. She weighed her options over in her mind. On the one hand, she could attempt to contact the signal source, but this may lead to their location becoming compromised, and that would mean that they'd have to find an exfil in a hurry. On the other hand, if there was a UNSC force left in the area, then she might be able to spot a sign of their location if they were to climb out of the valley and recon the surrounding areas from one of the mountain tops nearby. She weighed up the pros and cons of both options. A 4-man recon team wouldn't be fantastic, so she'd have to leave some of the Marines behind, but it would also mean they would need a secure location to return to if the signal was a trap. It seemed like the most logical option.
Weisner, get Vorstock. We're splitting up.
A few moments later, all 4 Marines were in the room together.
The plan is simple. We're going to split into 2 teams. O'Neill and I will head to one of the peaks of the local mountain ranges. I've got some binos and also the DMR. Using them, we'll recon the local area and see if we can locate any UNSC forces who the signal may have originated from. Forstock and Weisner, you'll stay here. We'll leave most of our equipment so we can move quickly. If we find the source, we'll come back and collect you. If not, we'll come back, pack up, and we'll get ready to move out on our own terms.
But didn't you say this location wouldn't be safe for long?
It won't. But it's secure for now, and the recon op won't take long. We'll get to the location, avoid the bandage, and be back before sundown. If we're not, you move on without us.
Why me? Nat's better at longer range work.
Exactly. So she is the perfect person to help Weisner keep watch while we're gone. That way, we keep everyone safe.
The Marines nodded, Holt seemingly settling their concerns. Weisner and Vorstock walked their comrades to the door, and then watched as the 2 Marines gently sprinted away into the woodland. Holt wasn't sure what they were going to find, but if they kept moving in a north direction, she knew they would come to the mountain ranges she could see on the horizon, and from there, they would be in a much better position to ascertain the circumstances on the ring. Her and O'Neill slowed into a slow jog as they began to move through the woodlands. They made sure to keep a wide arc around the field that they came from, knowing that Banished would likely still be entrenched around the crash site. It pained Holt to know that Cooper and Talbot's bodies were probably in Banished possession, but there was nothing she could do about it now. As the recon team continued to move through the woodland, they occasionally heard the whoosh of a banshee flying overhead. Now and then, they would also hear the discharge of banished weaponry in the distance, followed by eerie stillness. It was clear that their alien attackers were making their presence felt on the ring, but Holt was hopeful that the UNSC reinforcements they were bound to find soon would help them repel this small incursion and avenge the death of her friends. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity of running, the 2 Marines emerged at the rocky outcrop of the lower end of one of the mountains. The terrain became increasingly volatile and difficult to navigate, so the Marines had to sling their weapons on their backs to begin to scale the rock face. Eventually, it became more vertical than horizontal, and the Marines took a moment to catch their breath, eating rations and drinking water.
It's damn high, and that terrain looks lethal. We'll have to take our time.
Hey, it was your idea in the first place, Sarge.
At the Forerunner structure which the Marines had temporarily occupied, Vorstock was pacing back and forth on the observation platform, her BR-55 in hand. She didn't like that there were only 4 of them left on the ring, and she certainly didn't like the fact that the sergeant had decided to go and investigate that signal. They needed backup, but investigating something so strange was bound to be dangerous, and she wasn't entirely convinced that it would have originated from a UNSC source. Still, Holt was left in charge, and she had to follow her orders, even if she did work better alone. She was deep in her own thoughts when a scream came from deep inside the compound. It took her a moment to realize that this had been Weisner. As quickly as she heard him, things fell silent, and she felt a chill run down her back. She checked her rifle and turned, moving back into the inner workings of the Forerunner structure. She raised her rifle and cleared the corners quickly until she came to the room where the Marines had holed up. Weisner lay on his back, and as she got closer, it became quite clear that the poor Marine was dead. Something had sliced through his stomach, and it was clear that it had been hot and fast as it left a near-perfect vertical slit in his torso. She could see internal organs through the bloodied pulp and knew instinctively what had done this. An energy sword, a weapon favored by the Sangheili, and a weapon which could kill in a single blow. She could see that Weisner's bulldog shotgun lay next to him, just out of arm's reach. She found a small bit of comfort in knowing that her friend, at the very least, tried to fight back. There was a click as something hit the floor behind her, and she turned to see an empty corridor. But as her sight adjusted, she realized that something wasn't right. In the middle of the corridor, the empty air almost appeared to be shimmering. She didn't hesitate and fired 3 rounds in quick succession, impacting against the figure which stood there. At once, there was an alien sound, and 2 red blades quickly became visible, energy sizzling against the air as the hostile shields recharged, and its outline disappeared once more. She once again began to fire, but at this point, the creature had lunged forward and plunged the sword deep in her stomach. She moaned in agony as the BR-55 cluttered to the floor, and she fell back against the floor. She could feel her body becoming numb, but she didn't want to give up so easily. After all, she had been trained to take the enemy down with her. She reached around to the back of her utility belt, where a grenade was mounted, and pulled it to her front, desperately attempting to thumb the safety off of the weapon, despite the failing sense of feeling in her fingers. She was almost there, when the feeling dropped away altogether, along with her hand and the other half of her forearm. She looked down, more in shock than any real horror, and saw the grenade and some of the bloody remains of her arm drop to the floor in a mess. She turned, mouth agape, beginning to gurgle on blood as her eyes began to force themselves closed. For a moment, she saw a towering black figure with a red visor look down at her, almost in pity, and then everything went black. Across the ring, O'Neill and Holt were blissfully unaware of Vorstock and Weisner's fates, with no way to contact their fallen Marines. As the duo reached the peak of the rock work which they had spent some time climbing, they were able to get the view out across the ring, showing them everything from the crash site where the Prowler had come down, to further afield than they could see before. As they began to take in the view, both their faces dropped, and O'Neill's usually charming demeanor dissolved entirely. Waves of banished vehicles could be seen across the ring, including phantoms and banshees patrolling the skies, and armor columns of wraiths, marauders, and other vehicles picking their way through the fields. Foot soldiers could be seen everywhere, and large structures dotted on the horizon resembling old-school fortresses, with defensive walls, watchtowers, and other nasty-looking fortifications wrapped around them. On the hills and mountains in the distance, large banished structures could be seen reaching towards the skyline, including what appeared to be barracks, and also a string of anti-aircraft cannons set up in defensive formation. Here and there, the former remnants of UNSC forces could be seen, still smoking in some places. Old bases had been destroyed and vehicles abandoned. It was becoming painfully clear that the signal hadn't heralded a last bastion of human resistance, but rather it had heralded the arrival of something far, far bleaker.
This isn't an incursion. It's an invasion.
You have been listening to Halo Survival, a fan-made audio drama produced by Podcast Evolved and narrated by Henry Paul David. The voice of Captain Chris Cooper was performed by Cam 4K Studios. The voice of Sergeant Maria Holt was performed by Kirsty for Halo. The voice of Private Matthew Weisner was performed by Matthew Keel. The voice of Private Dan O'Neill was performed by Demetrius Hazel. The voice of Dr. Nate Talbot was performed by William Boyer. The voice of Private Natalie Vorstock was performed by Samantha Endrist. Guest starring Brad Jost and Tim Piper. Halo Survival was written by Thomas Fishenden and Colin Perkins. Audio drama created using assets from the Halo video games, and music from both the games and the Podcast Evolved original album. Thank you for listening, and evolve.
Hi everyone, it's Tom here at the end of the show, and I wanted to say a huge thank you for listening to and supporting this audio drama. We hope that you are just as excited for Halo Infinite as all of the crew here at Podcast Evolved are. This audio drama was created as a letter of love for the team at 343 Industries, allowing us to tell our own story in the beautiful world which they have been crafting for the upcoming video game. Thank you for keeping Halo alive for all of the fans. We are incredibly excited for the next 10 years of Halo. I want to say a special thank you to all of the voice actors, from everyone from the cast, to also Henry Paul, who was the narrator. You all really put a lot of energy into this drama, and it's incredibly humbling to have you all as a part of this. So thank you so much to everyone involved, and thank you to you, the listener. We appreciate you listening, and, as always, evolved.